Hi everyone, and welcome to the 13th episode of our Tandem Talks. So for those of you who are new to our Tandem, we are a progressive continuous performance management platform, and this is our thought leadership webinar series where we invite thought leaders, business leaders, and HR experts to join us and share their thoughts and expertise on a range of topics. So today we are joined by the incredible Tanya Jansen. So Tanya is the co-founder of Beacom, which is a cloud-based total compensation management platform, and it is used by global enterprises. Prior to launching Beacom in 2009, Tanya worked at SAP and Accenture, and she has spent her career in the enterprise software space with senior roles ranging from multiple organizations and over loads of functions. We are also especially delighted to have the co-founding member of Beacom here today, as Tandem and Beacom have recently announced a partnership that facilitates the performance management and compensation to work seamlessly together. So it's really exciting to have her here, and we're really glad. Tanya will also be joined today by Aisling Tayard, who is the CEO and founder of our Tandem, and they're going to be talking about the secret to transforming diversity through performance and pay. We do want this session to obviously be as interactive as possible, so please do use the chat box at the bottom as well as the Q&A function, and all your questions will be answered towards the end in the discussion phase. Final thing from me is that this session will be recorded, and we'll be sharing that with you following the session. So I hope you enjoy it today. I'm very excited to hear from both Aisling and Tanya, and I would like to hand it over to you, Aisling.
Thanks, Lauren, and hello, everybody. You're very welcome to Tandem Talks. I'm really excited to have Tanya here today because I know she is a true expert in her field. And this is a topic really close to my heart because I know that when I used to handle pay gap and gender pay gap challenges and so on for former companies I worked with, I looked at it in such a basic way. You know, are women and men paid the same for the same job? Which was a very basic way of looking at it. And I think learning so much through Tanya, there's so much more nuance and depth to it. So really excited to hear from Tanya. We'll be hearing from her over the next 20-25 minutes. And throughout that, please do share your comments and your questions. We'll get to those when Tanya's finished. And at that point, we'll go into a discussion and you'll be able to ask her plenty of questions. So thanks so much for joining us, Tanya, and it's over to you.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you both for the very enthusiastic introduction. And of course, I'm very excited to be here. I'm also very excited to work closely with you and your organization, as there's so much of an overlap between performance pay and feedback, and how all of those intertwine, and of course the impact that equity has and the role that it plays throughout these processes. And to touch a bit on the background that I have is, you know, since starting Beacom, I pretty much spend all of my time speaking with leaders across Comp and Ben, CHROs, in order to, you know, understand the challenges that they're facing and help them to better leverage technology in order to address those. And you know, it's over the last couple of years, the topic of pay equity has just come up, you know, consistently in, you know, first it was little by little, and now it's in, you know, every single conversation that we're having. And, you know, obviously there's a very natural link between how you manage pay equity and how you link it to how you pay and reward your people. But, you know, as Aisling said in the intro, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to look at it. There's a broader picture and other factors that need to be taken into consideration when, you know, when you're looking at your pay equity strategy and the steps that you want to take and how you want to integrate that, you know, throughout your performance and reward strategies. So throughout this presentation, I will first I'll share with you some statistics that we gathered through various surveys that we've launched over the last couple of years in order to understand, first off, how employees perceive this concept of pay equity and how their organizations are handling it. And then I'll also take you through, share with you a framework that you can use in order to achieve a more equitable and diverse approach to managing performance and managing pay. So first, to start out with some some high level information on the topic. There's a lot of data out there, aside from any surveys that we're launching. There's a lot of data out there that supports the fact that there is a gap in terms of how women are paid against men. There's even more of a gap in terms of how minority groups of female are paid against men on average, and this exists in a lot of different geographies. So there's no argument that there is a gap, and it's very much linked to gender and diversity factors. And since the pandemic, it's really had a negative effect in terms of all of the progress companies were making prior to the pandemic in order to close the gap. Then the pandemic hit, and it had an adverse effect. Why? Because you had a disproportionate amount of the workforce being female who had to leave the workforce. And now, as little by little, as they slowly come back into the workforce, they're coming in. In many cases, they're coming in at lower grades in the job scale, and of course, then lower comp as it relates to that. So just to give you a bit of perspective before we go into the details. So, understanding that there is a gap, then how is it that your employees feel about how they're being paid and how it relates to any type of perception of a pay gap? So first of all, coming back to the findings of the survey that we did, more than 1/3 of the workers that we polled, or the employees that we polled, believe that their pay is determined purely discretionary. So they don't believe that factors like performance or skills or experience are having any impact with how they're being paid. So either that means there's a lack of transparency in organizations in terms of understanding how those decisions are made, or it is the fact that it is purely discretionary, and that's leaving the door wide open for either intentional or unintentional biases that may happen during the compensation process, that then leads to why you have those gaps within organizations. So going into a bit deeper into our findings. So in terms of our overall survey, and the first one that we launched was in 2019, so prior to the pandemic, more than 75% of all employees that we surveyed, and this was across organizations of all sizes, across all industries, specifically in the US and UK. So 75% of those employees, they believe that within their own organization, there exists a pay gap. And there was differences across industries. So some industries, this perception of pay gap was much higher, specifically in the finance and the insurance industry, where it's pretty much known you have diversity issues and gaps in terms of gender gaps that are impacted there. In addition to that, more than half of employees, they don't know, or they don't believe that their managers or that their employer are taking any action in order to close that gap. So maybe there's a lot that companies are doing, but it's not being communicated to their employees. And there was a statistic I read recently from Gartner that said, I think less than 20% of organizations in those regions are actively communicating and talking about their approach or their commitment to closing the pay gap. So it's pretty low, and employees are not aware of it. In addition to that, a pretty decent majority believe that there should be some type of law or some type of governance that are mandating companies to disclose those pay gaps. And we know this is the case across various geographies, but it's not as uniform, and it's not as consistent within geographies or even regions, depending how we look at it. So they do believe that this is something that should be addressed, on the government level. And not just on the company level, but those things take time, and in order to wait for that type of legislation to get put in place, there's a lot of things that companies can do to preempt this and take action and communicate about it. And then the last point here is that of the people that we surveyed, especially for female workers who are a big portion making up that gap in pay, it's very important to them to work for a company that's taking action against this and taking these seriously. And so how does that impact your employees? So, anytime employees believe there's a gap in terms of how they're being paid, or any type of inequity in terms of how they're paid, it has an immediate impact on retention. So, their willingness or want to stay within a company is going to be impacted. So, of course, that's affecting turnover, which is an issue that everybody is dealing with and struggling with right now. And the second point on this here is this is really interesting. Is that people would rather find a new job than have discussions with their manager about pay. So employees don't even want to bring up the topic about pay. So it's still something that's very, very taboo, and organizations are not necessarily creating a culture of open communication and transparency for employees to feel comfortable having those type of conversations. But in addition to the survey we ran in 2019, our latest survey in 2021 came up with some additional statistics that support our findings then, and support findings around employees' want for more transparency. And there's a lot of talk that's happening in the media about publishing and communicating pay across all ranges of an organization, including executive pay. And kind of putting pressure on companies to be more transparent and be more open about how they communicate internally and externally about how they're paying their workforce. And I thought this was also interesting, is that a pretty significant amount of people said they would consider taking a pay cut for organizations that promoted such transparency. I mean, of course, you don't want to be the outlier when that type of information is being publicly shared. But transparency is really a big driver. And for me, this is not something new to the survey. This is these are issues that companies have been facing since I started talking to them years ago. Is how to provide this view to employees. In addition to that, the more companies talk about gender pay and the more they're communicating about approach to it, it of course is important to employees. They want to work for companies that are open about that are taking action against it and communicating about it. And that's just becoming more and more important. And I think the current environment has put a lot of pressure on organizations to, commit to stronger ESG and DEI goals as part of their overall image and the overall attractiveness of the organization as a whole. And, fundamentally in the end, it's these type of things are having an impact on retention. If employees don't understand, what they're being paid, why they're being paid, and if it's fair, it of course has an impact of whether or not they want to stay or they want to start looking around for jobs in other organizations. So now that you understand a bit of the context around our research, it's pretty fundamental that employees, this is important to your employees, and they understand that there's a gap, and they also need more clarity and understanding in terms of what you're doing to close the gap. So in the next couple slides, I want to take you through various steps that you can take in order to create a more equitable pay, or even promote greater gender diversity within how you're managing performance and rewards and various other aspects that have an impact on that. So of course, the first part, it's a bit, it's very much driven. It's very much driven by data. So how is it that you're looking at the inequalities, and how are you evaluating these? And Aisling, you said it perfectly for me in your intro, is that, in previous companies, you were looking at, oh, well, this is how I pay, this is how men are paid compared to women. And, this is fundamentally not the way to look at the data. There's so much more. There's so many more dimensions that need to be considered or factored into, having this view of really understanding, do I have inequalities where, and what could potentially be driving those? Fixing a pay gap or changing comp is a very prescriptive part of it. But, what's much more valuable is understanding what's driving that, where that's coming from, and how do I solve that even before it gets to a compensation and rewards issue. So looking at men and women, well, it's a start. It's definitely not enough. There's a lot of different attributes attributes that need to be used to ensure that you're comparing like for like, so groups of individuals that should be compared together. And a lot of companies, they start by leveraging job grades, and they start by leveraging benchmark data that they compile from external provider in order to have a starting point of where these employees should sit. But there's other factors like tenure, like training, like education, skill set, and of course performance data that has an impact in understanding where there might be a gap. And there's also the factor of location, and location-based pay has become a bit of a hot topic now, where if you look at how things were done before the pandemic, you determine how much you're going to pay someone or pay an open headcount based on where that role sits, where they're going to go to the office. So imagine you hire someone, in New York a few years ago on a New York salary, and now, since work from home may have become a norm, that employees working in Arkansas on a New York salary, where on the other hand, you're still hiring employees in New York to work out of the New York office at a New York salary. And so by default, by having these changes in location and not necessarily having changes in pay or pay philosophy, you're creating inequalities in GOMP that are unintended. So this whole concept of location-based pay and how you want to address it, and what type of uniformity you want within that also needs to be factored into how you group your individuals and how you evaluate where there could be gaps in terms of how you pay. And there's other factors too that need to be considered. So the gap in the pay is a result of it, but looking at and understanding where you might find some of these gaps. And I saw this at one of our customers. They're looking a lot at not just promotion data, but they're looking at how different genders and different ethnicities are moving throughout the organizational structure. So when they hire into the company, what type of position are they being hired in? Is it that more women are being attracted to lower level jobs or more entry level jobs? Or do you have diversity in terms of each level and where you bring in individuals? And then, of course, how does that impact pay? How does that impact promotion? Of course, as employees move up in grade, if you don't have diversity at the beginning, it's going to be a lot harder to have diversity in promotions that you do later on, and then you end up being forced to make decisions, not necessarily taking into consideration people who are best in the job. And then same thing as it relates to performance rating and performance assessment. And I was really surprised here to find all of the research that consistently shows that men still get higher performance ratings than women. So there's this whole bias that happens during the performance rating process. And I think most managers don't even know this or aren't even aware of it. So how do you take that into consideration, and what measures do you put in place to ensure that fair conversations and assessments are happening even before you're determining comp? Because of course performance is very much a driver for how you pay your people in the end. So having that way to look at your data and create like for like comparisons in order to understand what the underlying cause is, so then the steps that you need to take in order to fix it. It's not something, of course, that can be done overnight, but at least you're aware of where the gap is and what you need to do. And this is where I see a lot of organizations struggle, is they don't necessarily know where to start and how to get that picture and how to look at their data across various aspects. And the second point, and this one is one of my favorites. It's all about communication. And as a manager myself, I think just because we say something once, it should be remembered for all time, and that's definitely not the way it goes. So over communication is really really important. And there's two different aspects to think about when you're looking at communication. So there's communicating your approach to pay equity. And you remember the statistic I showed you earlier. 51% of employees don't believe that their organization is even taking steps to close the gender pay gap. And probably that's not the case, since, there's a lot of legal reporting that organizations are required to do in order to address the topic. So, if you have an approach to pay equity, make sure that it's something that you're communicating, from a top-down perspective. And then number two is how are you clearly communicating how you determine how people should be paid? So what is the process? What is the structure behind that? What are the different attributes that are driving that structure? And I come back to, again, one of the earlier statistics. If you have 1/3 of an organization who thinks their pay is totally discretionary, how do you ensure that you're over communicating the fact that it's not? And there is a lot of structure that's driving not just the compensation decision, but all of the factors that go into determining what that decision is. So having a structured and an automated process in place is of course critical in order to manage and remove those biases. And of course, the performance aspect is a really big driver, based on what I said before. And it's about how you give feedback and what kind of a culture you have in order to provide the most effective feedback. So, is it an open culture where employees feel that they can freely discuss with their managers, or is it, something that happens as part of a standard process that is viewed more as a necessary and rather than a value added? So I want to talk about a bit about the importance of feedback and how it plays within setting up this whole structure for an approach to fair pay. So coming back, I took some statistics that our Tandem shared with me in terms of how employees view feedback. And the good news, or for some of you maybe not, it's your employees, they want feedback, and once a week is not too much in order to have those discussions. And if you're having continuous ongoing discussions, that feedback can be considered much more effective and much more valuable than any type of development plans that you may have put in place, as well as the more you have those back and forth discussions, the more it becomes constructive and actionable rather than just a one-sided evaluation. So starting with how you look at the feedback process and how you look at performance management. And again, I think the majority of the companies that I talk to, with a few exceptions, they're managing performance the way they've managed it for a very, very long time, meaning it's a structured process. It happens maybe once a year, twice a year, maybe 4 times a year, and that's already a lot. It's linked to a goal framework, and a manager sits with employees, does an evaluation, and sends the form off to HR. That then is used to drive a compensation amount or certain decisions relating to comp and reward. And by default, if you're only evaluating your employee once a year, then again, employees are going to have the feeling that decisions are made with some kind of a bias. Of course, you're going to have top of your mind who you saw that day in the office, or who was the last person on your team that you interacted with that did a good presentation versus who you didn't. So by default, the nature of those one-sided conversations and the lack of frequency are helping to drive any inequalities that might become part of the process. So having more feedback as well, it's going to make it much easier and much more transparent for employees to talk to managers. The more they're doing it, the more they're going to feel open and comfortable in order to have those decisions around compensation. And it's something that even I experienced with a colleague of mine. And I think I probably talk to all my direct reports once a week, just again to see how things are going and see where they need help or any point of discussion. And so pretty informal, feedback and touch points that I had. And, I started out the conversation saying, "Hey, how's everything going?" He said, "Well, I'm not sure I'm being paid fairly." And I was like, "What?" So we had a really long discussion, and I talked through, this is the approach that we take. This is how we define our comp structure. These are the factors that come into play. Here's the history. So we went through very transparently, had the open conversation, and linked it as well to internal external benchmark it. And the end of the discussion was a really productive discussion. So, those are things that I didn't realize, and factors that I wasn't considering, or even thinking about. So you cannot, you can never over communicate enough, and discuss enough with employees. And it's really something that they're asking for, based on the data that we see. And in addition to that, if you think about, if you are doing a performance review and managing them on a, once a year, twice a year basis, and it's very much driven by, HR is on my back, they need the results, so I just have to get it done type of mentality. Then by switching to something that's a bit more frequent, you have much more impact as a manager. So there's a lot more, you're involved in the discussion. As well as, not just listening to your employee, but taking that feedback and doing something about it. So how do you take it, and how do you take those discussions and turn them into something actionable? And so the more you're putting managers at the center of that, the more you're making that discussion process meaningful. The employee sees value in it because they see something that's coming out of it. And here, that's really much aligned with how you link any type of a goal framework to those feedback and to those discussions. And goals as well. It's not something where you do it once a year and you're done for the year. This is something that is much more dynamic. And especially when COVID hit, I think overnight organizations had to completely change and realign what their strategies were and how they wanted their employees to work and what they wanted to work on. So having much more flexibility in terms of how you're setting that structure and adapting it based on those discussions that you continue to have with your employees is also going to be important. But then you still need to make the link between how performance is impacting not just how you pay your employees, but what you expect out of them, and use that as a way to check in and gauge how they are against expectation, and adapt when things change, so that they're much more aligned with the current working environment, as well as continuing to stay in line with the organization's objectives. A lot of times what happens is that companies, they may change their objectives, and they don't communicate it down to the employee level. So they don't have buy-in, and they don't have understanding in terms of how all of that fits together, and it's things like this that are going to lead to perceptions in pay gaps. I better hurry up. A bit running out of time. So again, coming back to that point, the more you can link each of those steps together, by default, you're going to remove any of the bias that's going to happen during the comp process, because you have a framework, and that framework is linked to a lot of different areas that you're inputting, so that those comp decisions should be, they really should be almost automatic. And again, the more you implement and practice this type of behavior, the more you have to communicate it, so that your employees understand the efforts that you're taking and the progress that you're making in order to ensure that you're closing the gap. And the last point I want to talk about is related to, it comes down to the hiring process. So, when you look for new people and when you have new jobs, it's important that you've defined upfront what you want to pay in order to fill the job, so that you're not going to be influenced by any discussion that you have with candidate that may have made a lot more in the past or a lot less in the past. Again, things that are very much driving inequalities that happen in terms of pay. Determine the pay up front, and then that way you're paying the person for the job and the skill set you want them to do for the job. And in some cases, even it has now become prohibited to even talk about or ask a candidate what they used to make in their previous job, again, in order to eliminate that bias. And then I want to touch a second on how to create a more diverse way in bringing on candidates. And I think in some cases the pandemic has really helped this, and that organizations have had the more flexibility in terms of where they can look for candidates. So by default, they can have a more diversified view. How do you define the skills that you want in terms of who you're looking for, and how are you evolving those skills as environments are changing much faster than they used to? And then who are you involving in the process? We all tend to be a bit biased in terms of the candidates that we're looking for and who we like in a position and who we don't like in a position. So the more you diversify who's involved within that process, the more you're going to help to attract a more diverse workforce into your organization and help solve those issues before they move down the funnel in terms of process. And then the last thing I want to close it up with, it's not a one and done type of approach. It's something that has to continue to evolve and change year after year. So, as you go through your rewards process, you're gonna have outcomes and there's going to be findings related to those outcomes. So you have to continue to adapt how you want to link pay to performance, how you want to use that to define job grades and how you attract your people, and how you continue to refine this process in order to ensure that you're having the impact that you want. And in the end, it's pretty obviously a win-win for everyone involved. Employees, they have a clear understanding of how they're being paid, why they're being paid, how it links to performance, skills, education, all these other factors. So you're taking out the guesswork and all of the smoke and mirrors that goes on behind the scenes. So they understand it's fair. They understand it's fair compared to their peers. And as a result, there's tons of business benefits across the organization, from improvements in turnover, improvements in engagement, performance. So there's a huge impact. So it might be a difficult task to start because you might not know where to start, but it's just costing you more the longer you wait. Okay, so I have come up for most of the time, so I think it's good if now we open it to any of the Q&A. So Aisling, I will just hand it over to you and you can field some of the questions coming from the audience.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tanya. I got so much out of that, and there's so much in it, isn't there? It's just there's so much depth and nuance, and it goes so much farther than my memory of it did, in terms of how people are tracing it right back to the root causes and not just trying to deal with the symptom that is gender pay. So just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to log your questions, your comments, your thoughts just about what you've heard today. We'd love to hear from you and get you involved in the discussion. So just use the chat button down below to share with us your thoughts about this. But I certainly have a couple of questions for you, Tanya, to kick us off, to get us going. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating there was, and it's even in those simple things like your colleague's example, she or he is obviously comparing themselves internally to somebody, thinking they're getting paid more than me. And sometimes there's a misconception, I guess, about where somebody is at relative to somebody else. You might think you're doing the same job at the same level, but that's not always the case. And that's where I guess the performance management element comes in so strongly, is if we're being really fair and honest with people and giving them that view of where they really sit, then maybe some of those things could be eliminated. But I read some research recently, and it was saying that women are 20% less likely to receive actionable growth-oriented feedback than their male colleagues. And when they do receive feedback, it tends to be praise, or it tends to be personality trait driven. So neither of those things could really help you develop or grow or so on. So we start biases very early on, don't we? In this whole process, there's biases throughout. And then there was another piece of research that was showing that women will often self-evaluate much more modestly than their colleagues. So even when they're going into their performance management review, they're reflecting a poor level of performance, then maybe they actually contributed, which of course biases the manager then, because if you only think you're okay, then we all only think you're okay, right? So it's so fraught with bias, isn't it? The whole process, and these are all tiny little symptoms that lead to gender pay gap challenges.
And I'm not sure managers are even aware to the extent that this exists. So I really think it's by taking the approach, by changing the process and educating the manager on how to give proper feedback and how to communicate it in a way that you eliminate or at least mitigate as much as possible those biases that arise, because it's something that you're not necessarily seeing when you're looking at when you're comparing your equitable pay group. So it just gets mixed, and it's a contributing factor, like you said.
Yeah. I love the examples of what you gave one of your clients are doing in terms of how they're tracing people's progression through roles. They're not just looking at, is she paid the same as him in the same role, but are they moving through the organization at the same pace? Are they exiting the organization at different paces and so on? I thought that was fascinating how people are using the data to tell a different story. Have you seen other clients do similar around data and how they're looking at the data now compared to how they would have done maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I see clients, they're definitely taking a much more robust view of the data, given that they have tools in place that enable them to do that. So, they can get more creative in terms of how they look at attributes and how they bring in different dimensions that they wouldn't necessarily bring in order to understand, is the issue that I have much more upfront in terms of I don't have a diverse workforce and that's what's resulting this, or and where is it happening? Where within the employee life cycle and within our job grade structure are these issues happening? And I think it's critical to understand that, rather than to use your word again, rather than take a prescriptive approach and say, okay, well, I need to promote more women to close the gap. That's not fair either. So I think it's critical that organizations have to do this to have a more fair approach in how they're even evaluating the data.
Yeah. And it's the controversial one, isn't it? But are people putting in targets around this, or kind of just ambitions around it?
Yeah, in certain countries, it's mandatory. So there's
right. Okay.
They have to put in legal targets in terms of they have a diversity promotion target they need to hit. And again, I think it's a bit, sometimes that can be a bit extreme, but I think all organizations now feel pressure to at least the ones who are known for not being as diverse as maybe they should be. They have pressure to do so. So if it's not mandated by government, it certainly is something that they're doing internally and taking as part of having stronger ESG and DEI frameworks in place.
Yeah. It's challenging, isn't it, to kind of look inside your own organization and I suppose admit to yourself that it's got to that point that actually people aren't being paid fairly or equitably. I remember I used to find those projects really, really difficult personally, because I was like, but I know I recruited them on a good salary and I know that they're performing equal, but yet you look across the salaries and go, but for some reason somewhere it's gone wrong over the years and they've ended up out of sync with each other, and we you have to admit to yourself when it is wrong. But there's kind of I feel like it's a very difficult thing to do internally for yourself. What's your views or your recommendations about if somebody is sort of thinking about reviewing this whole area, how they should go about it?
I don't want to get too technical, but it always comes down to, looking at your data and making sure that you're looking at your data the right way. And then, there's a cost associated to it. So the longer you wait, the more expensive it's going to be. And not just in terms of closing the gap, but it has a huge impact on retention. And I never expected for employees to be so sensitive about pay and their perception of pay and how it compares to, their peers who they think are working harder or less hard. And so there's this whole factor there that needs to be mitigated. And, the cost of losing someone that you've hired and you've trained, it's just far too high than taking what might be painful steps in the beginning to have a more structured approach with how you look at it and how you want to solve the issue moving forward. It's not going to get better.
Yeah, for sure. There's a comment in here from Claire. Thanks, Claire. She says, more of a comment than a question. Communication is key. Organizations make decisions around pay, but fail to communicate the rationale with employees. Then managers can sometimes blame HR, and we know that one, for the decision made because they either don't own the message or else don't know why the decision was made. Communication and transparency is key.
Yeah. And
it's so true, isn't it?
I repeat that again, and thank you, Claire, because you think you're communicating enough, double the efforts. It's still not enough. So,
yeah. There's never enough. All right, we have a question in from Jim as well on gender pay issues. What level depth of disclosure do you see companies engaging in order to offer reassurance? For example, global averages across company, by location, by business unit, etc.
Yeah, it's a good question, and if you look at it from a media perspective, they're really pushing to have it on the employee level on a global scale, so you can see, everything anyone in every department is making. And I think that's really dangerous. Why? Because there's so much. Comp is just one aspect of it. There's so many other factors in terms of what you pay to hire in people. There's a whole rewards and benefits side of it that needs to be factored into it. So I think that there needs to be a good balance in terms of, I think, providing averages, maybe not on a global basis, but more on a regional basis across different types of job is a start. Anyway, the data is all there and crowdsourced. So, and that's not necessarily helping organization and helping employees' perception, because they're going to find the data and find the data they want to fit the story that they're trying to fit. So, so it's a fine line, but something needs to be communicated.
Yeah, I remember in the noughties there was a bit of a craze. It was probably the more in kind of very progressive cultures and tech cultures and so on, where they were literally laying bare everybody's salary for everybody to see, and it was kind of an open book on what you got paid. And even I remember one company going as far as going, and you should determine what's fair for you. So it can go to an extreme, right? Where it's kind of gone out of control and the employees are now dictating the pay, which may not fit with the cost base, and you start to get into really challenging circumstances. But I guess that transparency thing, it's hard, it's a fine line, isn't it? It's not as straightforward as, because, there are nuances in experience levels of people who may be doing a similar job to you, but actually came in with 10 years more experience, and that was their market rate versus somebody who's a bit more junior on their career growth. So there's that fine line in communicating lots, but transparency is hard to make work.
But the communication is really key. So the more you can as a manager, you can have those discussions with your employees. It's hard to standardize from an employee level. So I think the manager needs to be more involved and have more accountability for the decisions that get made into what they're paying employees, and make sure that they understand that and all of the nuances that go into it.
Yeah. There's ultimately an element of trust too, isn't there? Like if you have a trusted relationship with your manager, because I thought that statistic that you shared was striking, that 16% of people will just prefer to leave than have the conversation with their manager, which is just startling that they can't even bring it up. But it's probably so true. And now we see with the Great Resignation that people are leaving even without another job to go to. They're just leaving. So as soon as something doesn't work for them, they're out of there. And I guess it goes back to, we've got to build those very strong, trusted relationships between managers and employees so that they can have those conversations. And even if it's a slightly awkward conversation to have in their mind, because they trust their manager, they'll have it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe I take it for granted being in a smaller organization, so these things are easier. But I see the value across the board. It's it has so much more of an impact when you know that your manager is there fighting for you. You're willing to do anything, and it has an impact on not just you but the morale of the team. So there's only positive. As transparency, it's hard for people, and it's hard to have things that are deemed as more, personal type of conversations. But it's just because it's hard, it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. And there's only benefit that can come out of it one way or another.
Yeah, and it makes all of those conversations that happen throughout the way you were saying, that more frequent approach to performance and so on, all the more compelling, because we can have if we're having those conversations throughout the year, then we're able to have the ultimate difficult conversation with each other.
Exactly. And it doesn't fester up, you can you imagine if you don't talk to you don't have any type of a discussion for 6 months, and the problem just gets worse and worse and worse. And then by the time you have the discussion, it's too late. So
yes,
better to have it up front.
It's so true. We have another question in, but I see Lauren has appeared, which is usually a symbol to us that we need to wrap it up. So perhaps we can follow up on any questions following on from the webinar, and indeed with your information. But thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the discussion with you, Tanya, and thanks for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Yeah,
and over to you, Lauren.
Sorry, I could have listened to that for another 10 minutes at least. So apologies to interrupt, guys. But yes, unfortunately, it's the end of today's webinar. So thank you so much, Tanya, for joining us today. And thank you, Aisling, for moderating as well so wonderfully. And obviously, thank you to the audience for joining us and getting involved with your questions. Great participation as always. We do have some fantastic guest speakers lined up for the rest of the year, so please do follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date with any of our future sessions. I've just shared that in the chat if you follow the link there, as well as Tanya's profile and BCom's profile too, if you'd like to follow them directly. This session has been recorded, and we're going to be sharing that with you all either today or tomorrow, as well as the slides, so you've got that information there for those that wanted it. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you had a lovely rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Tandem Talk.